Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guests for this series are Mary Cohen, Stuart Duncan, and Lee Willingham. Mary is an associate professor of music education at the University of Iowa. Stuart is director of programming and diversity recruitment at the Graduate School at the University of Connecticut. And Lee is a professor of music education at Wilfrid Laurier University. In addition to their faculty positions, Lee is the editor of Community Music at the Boundaries, published in 2021 by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. And Mary and Stuart are co-authors of the forthcoming Music Making in U.S. Prisons, Listening to Incarcerated Voices, also published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. We'll get to hear about our guests' books, of course, but we'll also be having a discussion about community music, its anti-institutional roots, its inherent activist and inclusive characteristics, and how this relatively new area of scholarship has flipped the instructional model to make the musician privileged over the music. Even further, we'll speak with Mary and Stuart about how music can transform a broken system. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In this first episode, we get to meet our guests and start with a definition of community music, which is more difficult than you might think. Okay, Stuart, Lee, and Mary, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Sure. So I think to get started, if each of you could just provide for our listeners just a bit of background on yourself and your academic interest. How did you get involved in studying community music? And Mary, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Well, I am a music educator at the University of Iowa. Prior to that, I have been involved in music in my life through piano playing more so than ensembles. Many of my students that are earning their degrees to be music teacher end up working in their schools as a choir member, orchestra, or band. So I've come about it through more of a music for a functional purpose. I played piano quite a bit for worship services. And then when I decided to study music education in a more academic way, I started to look at music making as a way to build caring and collaborative communities, particularly with opportunities for allowing the musicians to courageously express themselves through songwriting, through improvisation. And then I learned about music education in prisons and started to dig into that and became very curious about everything related to the harmful practices that we have in the United States in prisons, and realized that music making can be a tool toward abolishing some of these harmful practices. And I've been exploring it in many, many different ways since then.
Excellent. Stuart, let's move on to you.
Thanks, Bill. I grew up in the southeast of England originally and moved to the United States in 2006 when I had the opportunity to study for a DMA in composition at Cornell University, which was really quite a life-changing experience moving across the pond, as it were. But what was more impactful for me was actually having the opportunity to propose a class to teach at Auburn Maximum Correctional Facility in Auburn, New York, in upstate New York. And the proposal was selected, and I was amongst several other faculty members, and at the time I was a graduate student finishing my DMA, to actually go into the facility and teach a 15-week-long course. And that for me was really pretty life-changing in terms of just pedagogy, in terms of self-reflection, on some of my privileges. And so ever since then, I've sort of taken that experience, and it's been a part of my own exploration over the last decade or so. I've, recently had the opportunity to do a lot of diversity recruitment for the University of Connecticut, where I now work as the director of programming and diversity recruitment for the graduate school. And it's just a really great opportunity for me to sort of explore those ideas that sort of were seeded when I was teaching that course.
Excellent. Perfect. And then Lee, how about you?
Thank you, Bill, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you for this opportunity. I began my career in music education pretty much in a routine way. I went through teachers college and got a degree and got certified to teach in the public high schools in the Toronto area. Taught for 15 years in a lively, thriving music program. Went into some administrative work at the Board of Education level. Did graduate work and ended up being at the University of Toronto in the teacher education program. And in 2004, I moved to Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. It's about 100 kilometers or an hour west of Toronto. And they're in charge of music education and choral studies, but always feeling, and as I have throughout my entire career, that we're not servicing the majority of the population in traditional music education, that there are hundreds and hundreds of students that are not taking music and not interested in doing so formally. And yet, our research and our personal experience indicates that everybody that I know of has music in their lives. So, my migration into community music came through contact at a world conference in Bologna, Italy in 2008. And out of that came a research center and a graduate program in community music, and now an undergraduate program with a PhD proposal. So, as a music educator, I hold to pedagogical and learning theory values and all of those kinds of things. But the tent is big, the lane is wide to incorporate and to invite a wider segment of the population into participatory music making. So that's the short version of my very long story.
Excellent. So you mentioned community music, Lee, and that's basically the topic of our conversation on for this series. And you've edited a collection of essays called "Community Music at the Boundaries," which was published this year. Can you define for us what community music is? What are its origins, and what are its more contemporary intentions?
Well, I'm kind of coming late to the game, so its origins predate my involvement. But the way we understand community music as an emerging discipline is that its roots are in the UK and perhaps in Ireland, where music was introduced into underserviced communities to help young people, essentially. But now, as an area of study, it really defies a tight definition.
Hmm.
I think it lives in its local cultural and community context, so it presents itself in a number of diverse ways. It could be a community choir, it could be a band or an ensemble. However, it could also be a song circle in a seniors community, or it could be a drum circle exploring West African Caribbean genres. It might happen in a school classroom where there's a sense of social democracy or co-creating taking place and where hierarchical barriers are not there. We've tried to define it a number of times, Bill. In an earlier publication, I'm just going to read some of what we wrote a few years ago,
Okay.
where we said, we define community music as a field of practice that has been gaining steady momentum over the last decade. It places emphasis on inclusive musical participation as an expression of cultural democracy. Community music reflects a bottom up or negotiated curriculum that involves a music leader or a facilitator in continuing dialogue with the people present. We often say that it is easier to describe the characteristics and domains of community music or to describe its practices than to confine it to a definition. I'll stop there. I could go on, but to ask to define it is dependent on its cultural and community contexts.
Mm-hmm. So, Mary, anything you wanted to add to that, or Stuart, in terms of perhaps the definition or characteristics of that?
Thank you, Bill. Lee, beautiful definition, beautiful description. In addition to everything that Lee said, many times community musicians and music educators, but especially community musicians, have a very clear sense of purpose. They've really done a lot of reflection as to what brings them to the space where they're working, what their goals are for that space, and collaborating very, very closely with the people who are engaged in the music making so that it's a partnership, and the process of doing the community music activities leads to hopefully what each party is wanting in their purpose.
Excellent.
Let me just add a little bit to build on Mary's point,
Yep.
because she said what I didn't say. So what we would say is that those who do community music work do so with a commitment to music expression as more than just music, but it's a crucible for social transformation, emancipation, empowerment, and cultural capital. Therefore, community music is an interventionist approach between music leader and those participants. So as I support Mary's comment, that there's always an intention behind it.
Right. Thank you, Lee. And I think what's really exciting about that is because community music has grown so much in this last decade, and the potential for it to be applied in other contexts is really rich. So my hope is through this work that we're all doing, we can engage with other disciplines, other people in other sectors, and grow community music in ways that for the greater good, new ways.
Yep. Lee and Mary, you've both mentioned now the sort of, Lee, you mentioned the momentum in the last decade, and Mary, the growth of community music. Are you saying that as it's growing in practice and performance, or is it growing because as researchers you're discovering more about it and learning more about it and putting that scholarship further out into the field, or is it both? What's been going on the last decade, basically?
I'll briefly mention just all of the above, everything you said, Bill, and really highlighting Lee's program and Kathleen Turner's program in Ireland, these really thoughtful programs that are engaging students in new creative ways to really push them to think about what brings them to community music.
Mm.
And the research, the publications, the practice has just grown so much. When I first started at the University of Iowa, I would teach a community music class, and there were just a few materials to look at, plus lots and lots of activities to do. And then the quantity of that's grown so much. I just had a powerful conversation with one of Lee's students Friday morning about some of the work she's doing. And it's so clear to me that the students coming through these programs are thinking in new, rich, critical ways. And all of that, I think, is what's contributing to the growth of community music.
Mm.
I would just say that we look at community music kind of as a grassroots activity that people do. And when grassroots activities evolve into an academic area of study, the hope is that we don't in any way contaminate those grassroots activities, but the wholesome purpose of making music together as community is contained, even though we are now poking and probing and prodding to find out what's going on under the layers. So it's kind of an interesting. I remember all the earlier meetings I went to with the Community Music Activities Commission were always talking about that we're not an academic subject. We are a participatory practice. And I would say now we are an academic subject that holds applied practice close to our hearts, because that informs our research, and our research is only useful as it informs practice.
And we need to keep looking critically with very careful reflection on the world and what's happening and how we are contributing toward its betterment and maybe inadvertently contributing toward problematic outcomes.
Mm. You just heard from Mary Cohen, Stuart Duncan, and Lee Willingham. Mary is an associate professor of music education at the University of Iowa. Stuart is director of programming and diversity recruitment, the Graduate School at the University of Connecticut. And Lee is a professor of music education at Wilfrid Laurier University. This episode is brought to you in part by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week for a discussion about community music as it's situated in the carceral state.
And this quote goes, if the end goal is to warehouse human beings, then the American prison system is a costly but effective design. However, if the goal is to prepare people to live as law-abiding, contributing citizens, then objective data suggests that our prison system is a stellar example of failure, ripe for reconsideration. And that's always spoken to me as we've been working our way through this book, that really, how can we reconsider such an ingrained, especially in the United States, it's such a problematic system. And I think it's through music that we have a lens into starting to unpack what this reconsideration could look like.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.